Hello, everyone. I hope you had a chance to at least move your head a little bit, get into the music. It's always my favorite way to start a workshop. I don't know if you guys have been in a workshop with Liza Toulousan, but that's how she starts, and that's like my thing now. I absolutely love it. Welcome to Cultural Competency and Change Management. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. If you'll just give me a second to get this situated and underway. All right, can everyone see just my screen, or do you see a bunch of? Excellent, thank you. All right, so welcome to the presentation entitled Cultural Competency, and I'm going to, you can see my face. I don't want to see my face, I'm going to see you all. Welcome to the presentation entitled Cultural Competency, the space between us. My name is Leah Nestor. I'm the Director of Cultural Competency and Inclusion at Savannah Country Day School. I started this, I started as a lower school music teacher about 10 years ago. And about 4 years ago, created the senior administrative level position that I'm in now. As we move through this presentation, you will see each section is entitled, or each section is titled as a unit. This presentation is actually an e-learning module that I created for the administrators at my school. Administrators are overwhelmed and overworked during the time of COVID and our country having an awakening. I created something that our administration can use as professional development and complete at their leisure. It's a total of about 45 minutes and can be completed in 5 to 7 minute increments. As we move through this presentation, please feel free to leave questions in the chat. I can't guarantee you that I will get to them, but if you leave your email next to the question, I will save the chat and email you back. So let's begin. I love this quote by Jim Highwater, The Primal Mind, in his book, The Primal Mind. The greatest distance between people is not space. The greatest distance between people is culture. I'm going to go back one slide. We will not cover each topic in depth, but this will give you an overview of the topics and levels of engagement that are needed in order to close the distance between people and cultures. Reflection, awareness, knowledge, and skills are attributes that are necessary for the journey towards closing the distance between people and cultures. Terry Cross highlights 24 attributes that one needs to have to obtain cultural and ethnic competence. The necessary components can come through personal attributes, which are broken up into reflection and awareness, knowledge, and skills. This module only touches the surface of the attributes listed by Cross, but hopefully you will be given an overview of the work that is necessary to begin the journey to being culturally competent. The term competence or competency is highly controversial, as some of you may know, as one cannot arrive at competency in someone else's culture. We will use the term competence or competency as a never-ending practice and acquisition of skills. We will explore identity, implicit bias, race and racism, and cultural competency. Identity is a topic that provides us with a mirror to reflect on ourselves before we engage in this work. The exploration of implicit bias will make us aware of what is hindering us from doing this work. The subject of race and racism brings us knowledge around how individuals and organizations contribute to oppressing an entire group of people. And cultural competency gives you the skills to begin dismantling individual behaviors and systemic institutions in an effort to bring about effective change in our institutions. It is worth noting that the knowledge area can have any ism or oppressive topic inserted: sexism, homophobism, whatever it is that you believe your institution needs in the area of knowledge or you yourself need. As stated before, this presentation splits Cross's personal attributes into 2 categories. The topics identity and implicit bias will cover reflection and awareness. Race and racism will highlight the type of knowledge one can achieve, and cultural competency will list the skills needed. Closing the distance and the space between us requires change. As an organization with systems, policies, and people, what will you need to accomplish in order to bring effective change to your organization? As we move through this presentation, ask yourself the following questions. What preconditions are missing that are keeping us from having effective change? Do we have knowledge but not skills? Does my school or organization bring awareness but lack the skills necessary to change? Are we lacking the skills of cultural competency and therefore there's much anxiety surrounding this work in our community? Are we lacking the resources to allow our faculty and staff to do this work effectively, leaving them frustrated? Are we committed to this work but have no plan and find ourselves back where we started? And I want to reiterate that cultural competency is not something you can achieve or even check off of a list. It is a skill that you will always need to sharpen. You can't be competent in someone else's culture, as I said before. You can hone a set of skills that will bring your organization closer to be a place where all stakeholders feel like they belong. As you move through this presentation, I hope you will consider what changes you need to make as an individual and what changes your institution needs to make to begin the journey towards cultural competency. The first category is reflection, in which we will cover identity. In this category, we will cover what is identity, the concepts of identity, the identity of an organization, and reflection questions. The definition of identity is a complex one. Beverly Daniel Tatum defines the concept of identity as being shaped by individual characteristics, family dynamics, historical factors, and social and political contexts. Let's look at groups within society and narrow it down to individuals. A social group is a set of individuals who hold a common social identification or view themselves as members of the same social category. Once in society, people derive their identity or sense of self largely from the social categories to which they belong. Each person, however, over the course of his or her personal history, is a member of a unique combination of social categories. Therefore, the set of social identities making up that person's self-concept is unique. Identity is based on concepts that changed based on an individual's experiences. For this reason, individuals may categorize themselves in particular ways, in a group or a role, to feel valuable and worthy, and to feel competent and effective. How one identifies can be broken down into 4 categories: self-esteem, self-efficacy, self-categorization, and self-verification. One's self-esteem is enhanced by evaluating the in-group and the out-group on dimensions that lead the in-group to be judged positively and the out-group to be judged negatively. Self-efficacy allows a person who, having performed well in an in-group, gains a sense of control over the environment in an attempt to accomplish the feeling of being competent and effective. Self-categorization is reflexive in that it can take itself as an object and can categorize, classify, or name itself in particular ways in relation to other social categories or classifications. Self-verification is seeing the self in terms of the role as embodied in the identity standard and behaves so as to maintain consistency with the identity standard. A person's identity is deep and not always explicit. We must reflect on our own identity and social construct in order to begin to understand the social identities of others. The external or conscious part of culture is what we can see and is the tip of the iceberg. It includes behaviors and some beliefs. The internal or subconscious part of culture is below the surface of a society and includes some beliefs in the values and thought patterns that underlie behavior. To evaluate the identity of an organization, we can use Dilt's model of nested levels to guide leaders to locate the leverage point for initiating change. For maximum effect, it asks the questions: who are we? Are we who we say we are? Why do we do what we do? And what do we need? So take a moment and reflect on the following questions through the lens of an individual and then your organization. As an individual, who am I? As an organization, who are we? Are we who we say we are? As an individual, what is my belief system? Or as an organization, what is our belief system? As an individual, how will I develop the skills I need for effective change? As an organization, how will we develop the skills we need for effective change? This PowerPoint will be available for you, and for the sake of time, I will keep going. But these are reflection questions that can help you to reflect on the identity unit. The next category is awareness, in which we will discuss implicit bias. For this category, we will cover the definition of bias, implicit bias, the implicit association test, if you haven't taken that yet, and reflection questions. According to Greenwald and Krieger, bias is defined as something that can be either favorable or unfavorable. Implicit biases are discriminatory biases based on implicit attitudes or implicit stereotypes. Implicit biases are especially intriguing and also especially problematic because they can produce behaviors that diverges from a person's avowed or endorsed beliefs or principles. The term bias, sometimes referred to as response bias, denotes a displacement of people's responses along a continuum of possible judgments. Response bias need not indicate something unwise, inappropriate, or even inaccurate. For example, instructors may vary in their response bias in grading, such that some assign a relatively high grade to average student performance, while others assign a lower grade to the same performance. An implicit attitude is an action that indicates favor or disfavor towards some object, but is not understood by the actor as expressing that attitude. For example, a voter may vote for a particular candidate even though the voter knows nothing other than the candidate's name. One of the things that might influence a voter to vote for this candidate is that the candidate's name shares one or more initial letters with the voter's name. In such a case, the vote can be understood, at least in part, as an implicit expression of the voter's self-favorable attitude. A social stereotype is a mental association between a social group or category and a trait. The association may reflect a statistical reality, but that is not always the case. Stereotypes can involve associations of either favorable or unfavorable traits with a social group. In summary, biases are discriminatory biases based on implicit attitudes or implicit stereotypes. Implicit biases are malleable. Research has shown that when a person forms a new personal connection with a member of a previously devalued outgroup, implicit attitudes toward that group may change dramatically and rapidly. Are you wondering what implicit biases you might have? Wonder no more. You can take the implicit association test through Project Implicit. The implicit association test is a way to acknowledge and alter your implicit biases. And I won't go through this particular part of the presentation just to save time, but Project Implicit, if you haven't had the opportunity to do an implicit association test, is a wonderful tool that has been created for you to understand and see what your implicit association tests are. So I'm going to move through this into the reflection questions. What implicit biases do you have? A great question to reflect on. How will you form personal connections with previously devalued groups or groups you have a negative bias towards? Next, we're going to move to race and racism. The next category in this is knowledge, in which we will cover race and racism. In this unit, we will cover the definitions of race and racism, the effects of racism, ethnic racial identity, also known as ERI, race, racism in the developing child, and reflection questions. I particularly really like this category, but please note that you may put any ism or oppressive topic in the knowledge base. What you really want is to move through this trajectory of identity, awareness, and then knowledge. Race is defined as genetic and biological differences associated with racial heritage, as well as socially constructed lay theory of the boundaries between people, Although some can argue that the definition of race is complex, the definition around racism has been debated for quite some time, and we're going to get into what that debate might be. The key division in the debate over the nature of racism is between the definition of racism as an individual attitude or behavior, hatred, stereotyping, unequal treatment, and the view of racism as a set of systemic and institutional practices. Defining racism in individual terms both reinforces and is reinforced by the colorblind frame, which holds that racism in the United States is no longer a significant problem, but has been reduced to the isolated acts of bigots or racial supremacists. This has implications for everyday life, for our students, for our faculty, for our community. Competing definitions of racism lead to different answers. In general, if racism is defined as race-based prejudice or discrimination, then it seemingly logically follows that anyone can be racist, including members of both dominant and oppressed groups. On the other hand, if racism is linked to institutional power, then it follows that only members of the dominant group, i.e. whites in the United States, can be racist. Racial discourse does not occur in a vacuum. It is shaped by the changing structure of racial conflict and racial ideologies in the larger society. The civil rights movement led to a decline in ideologies of racial superiority, a reduction of the most blatant forms of segregation amidst formal legal recognition of civil rights, and an increase in white support for racial equality. The dominant ideology in this endeavor has been colorblindness, the assertion that race should not matter in public decision-making or private interaction, and that it is therefore illegitimate to take race into consideration, even if the goal is to ameliorate inequality or redress past injustices. This ideology of colorblindness has enabled practitioners to claim the legacy of Martin Luther King Jr. in the civil rights movement, citing one of his more famous quotes: "We should not judge by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character." And I can imagine that on today, you can count how many times you've seen that quote. This colorblind approach leads practitioners to attack race-based remedies such as affirmative action and political redistricting as violations of democratic principles, and deriding multiculturalism as identity politics or political correctness. An integral component of the colorblind paradigm has been the strategy of denial, the claim that racism is a historical phenomenon that is no longer a significant problem in American society. The idea of race as a biological dividing line between people is commonly held and powerful in its consequences. Race and ethnicity are in their lived experience and in their consequences more similar than different. Ethnicity is usually defined in demographic terms based on national origin and the cultural characteristics associated with national origin, language, preference, customs, and social norms. Highlighting the overlapping meaning of race and ethnicity, there is a strong correlation between race and cultural practices or social norms and linguistic practices. For example, there are important ethnic and cultural features to African Americans' racial identity. And there is growing interest in investigating the ethnic foundation to African Americans' identity. What has been considered racial identity is more accurately labeled a racial ethnic cultural identity. There is much in common when considering racial and ethnic influences on children and their development. Adults may also express prejudice toward children through stereotyping, hostility, or rejection. Additionally, those in authority, such as teachers or police officers, may act on negative expectations, decreased tolerance for behavior, and many other racially driven behaviors. Racism may come from peers in the form of name calling on the playground or social exclusion in activities. Very early in childhood, children become aware of race as a category of person, not long after they develop attitudes and beliefs about members of different racial groups, although the immediate and societal context in which those attitudes form affects their strength and consequences. Through middle childhood, children become increasingly aware of cultural stereotypes that they may not personally endorse. With this awareness comes the possibility that children's development, for example, their academic trajectories, may be shaped by situational cues that signal that children are devalued because of their race. Chronic experiences with racism may also affect children's mental health, but the relationship between racism and well-being is far from straightforward. Children, particularly ethnic minority children, develop important ideas about the role of race in their lives and who they are as people. In short, changes in children's understanding of and response to race and racism from birth to adulthood are nothing short of revolutionary. We rapidly and automatically categorize and judge others on the basis of their group membership. And from this deeply human tendency flow many consequences. To understand the psychology of racism as it dawns in human consciousness is a step toward freedom from its most untoward manifestations and consequences. Through greater understanding of racism's birth and development in the human mind, we may learn to prevent and reduce entrenched hatreds and quieter forms of intergroup divisions. So this is a moment where, again, you can reflect on the category of race and racism. What other forms of discrimination should you gain knowledge around? What are the practices and policies in place that continue systemic racism in your institution? How will understanding and dismantling racism move you a step closer to closing the space between us? And again, if you came on after I've said this, I will provide this presentation, and the reflection questions will be there for you as well. So this is the point in the presentation where we really begin to talk about, we've talked about identity, we've talked about reflection and awareness and knowledge, and many times you will see people on a journey where identity is enough for them. They reflect and that's all they do. Then others may become aware, may begin to read and understand and gather knowledge. But the hard part is honing the skills of what it takes to have a culturally competent institution. For this category, we will cover the definition of cultural competency, the 6 stages of Cross's model, how to implement effective change, the essential elements of cultural proficiency, and again, a set of reflection questions. Cultural competence or competency is defined as a set of congruent behaviors, attitudes, and policies that come together in a system, agency, or professional and enable that system, agency, or professional to work effectively in cross-cultural situations. To give you an overview of the cultural stages that organizations may be complicit in, we will use the 6 stages of the Cross model. As we move through these stages, imagine a continuum which ranges from cultural destructiveness to cultural competence. The most negative end of the continuum, and as you move through this, I want you to begin thinking of which one do I identify my institution as? Where do I think we are as an institution? The most negative end of the continuum is represented by attitudes, policies, and practices, which are destructive to cultures and consequently to the individuals within the culture. The most extreme example of this orientation are programs which actively participate in cultural genocide, the purposeful destruction of a culture. The next position on the continuum is one at which the system or agencies do not intentionally seek to be culturally destructive, but rather lack the capacity to help minority clients or communities. They may act as agents of oppression by enforcing racist policies and maintaining stereotypes. Such agencies are often characterized by ignorance and an unrealistic fear of people of color. The characteristics of cultural incapacity include discriminatory hiring practices, subtle messages to people of color that they are not valued or welcome, and generally lower expectations of minority stakeholders. At the midpoint on the continuum, the system and its agencies provide services with the express philosophy of being unbiased. They function with the belief that color or culture make no difference and that we are all the same. Such services ignore cultural strengths, encourage assimilation, and blame the victims for their problems. While these agencies often view themselves as unbiased and responsive to minority needs, their ethnocentrism is reflected in attitude, policy, and practice. Culturally competent agencies are categorized by acceptance and respect for difference, continuing self-assessment regarding culture, careful attention to the dynamic of difference, continuous expansion of cultural knowledge and resources, and a variety of adaptations, to service models in order to better meet the need of their minority stakeholders. This point on the continuum is characterized by holding culture in high esteem. The culturally proficient agency seeks to add to the knowledge base of culturally competent practice. Again, one cannot be competent in someone else's culture, but you can always move to gaining knowledge and understanding and awareness and reflection on that culture, as well as the culture within your school and the culture you have created. You seek to add to the knowledge base of culturally competent practice by conducting research and hiring staff who are specialists in culturally competent practice, such as an agency advocates for cultural competence throughout the system and improved relations between cultures throughout society. Attitudes, policies, and practice are three major arenas where development can and must occur if an agency is to move toward cultural competence. Attitudes change to become less ethnocentric and biased. Policies change to become more flexible and culturally impartial. Practices become more congruent with the culture. Positive movement along the continuum results from an aggregate of factors at various levels of an agency structure. Every level of the agency, board members, policymakers, administrators, teachers, students, and families, can and must participate in this process. At each level, the principles of valuing difference, self-assessment, understanding dynamics, building cultural knowledge, and adapting practice can be applied. As each level makes progress in implementing the principles, and as attitudes, policies, and practices change, the agency becomes more culturally competent. The following essential elements are instrumental in organizations, systems, and agencies achieving cultural proficiency. To assess culture is to identify and learn about the differences among the people in your environment. Valuing diversity means embracing differences as contributing to the value of the environment. Managing the dynamics of difference allows you to reframe the differences so that diversity is not perceived as a problem to be solved. Adapting to diversity means teaching and learning about differences and how to respond to them effectively. And institutionalizing cultural knowledge means changing the systems to ensure healthy and effective responses to diversity. So where are you on the continuum of cultural competence? What attitudes, policies, and practices are in place at your institution? How will you implement the essential elements of cultural proficiency? I feel like I've been talking for a long time, so I'm going to take a moment and check in. Maybe you can check in the chat. How's everyone? Is everyone doing? Are we all here? And then we'll move to the summary, which hopefully will be a little bit more engaging. But I just want to take a moment and pause and do a check-in. Awesome. Wow, we're doing good from London. Wow. London, that's amazing. All right, so we're coming in. Okay, so we're doing good. That's what I want to hear. It's hard to when you're on Zoom to get a feel for how everyone is doing when you're the one talking nonstop. All right, thank you for the responses. So we're gonna move in, and hopefully this is the second half where I will be able to engage with you a little bit more. So we're gonna summarize what we just talked about. For this summary, we will cover the model to achieve cultural competency, managing change, and being critically conscious. A precondition of this process is the desire to engage, which reflects the assumption that educators and professionals seeking cultural competence training must be willing to engage in the process. The process of change starts with the personal desire to engage other cultures, developing knowledge of different cultures and a critical understanding of our personal biases, developing skills that would allow us to effectively engage people from diverse cultures, and understanding the degree of organizational support needed to engage in culturally competent practices. The implementation of cultural competence involves organizational and systemic changes. As you consider a more culturally competent organization in school, organizational support and managing change is key. This managing change diagram by T. Nestor lists the following preconditions that are necessary for effective change: vision, attainable objectives, skills, incentives, resources, an action plan, and monitoring and evaluating progress. So I want you to consider the following questions. I'm going to go through each of these, and then we're going to take a moment, and I'm going to hopefully be able to put you all into breakout rooms. But what is your vision for institutional change, right? If you're an administrator, if you're a head of school, if you're a division head, what is your vision for institutional change when it comes to cultural competency? Have you shared this vision with your stakeholders? How will you create a shared vision? Why do you want to be culturally competent? Instead of thinking of SMART goals, how can you create culturally competent goals, right? Are underrepresented minority groups receiving equitable access to your services? What is your current school's climate? Who are your underrepresented minority groups? What impact is your curriculum having on underrepresented students, and so forth? How culturally competent is your staff? What skills do you already have within your organization? What skills do you need to hone? What are the incentives for being a culturally competent institution? Who will benefit from institutional change? And what are the long-lasting effects? What resources do you have in place or will you need to get? What trainings will you need to budget for, and where will you find reputable resources for this work? And most importantly, how will you create an action plan? Who needs to be involved in that action? And this is where schools lose good people. If you were in Rodney Glasgow's keynote this morning, he said, "We know this work takes time, and we will do this work alongside you. But if there is no action plan, you will have false starts and frustration will set in, and you will lose good people." Who will be responsible for monitoring and evaluating your progress? Will you hire a diversity practitioner? Will you put together an equity committee? Will you adjust your teacher evaluation to ensure the cultural competency goals are being met? And finally, the acquisition of a set of skills or knowledge of cultural attributes that can often turn into detrimental stereotypes is not the ultimate goal. Cultural competence is always working towards being critically conscious and having the knowledge and awareness to carry out the roles and responsibilities you have as an educator and professional. So this diagram here is from a former professor of mine, Dr. Robert Siddell. We called him Bob. He's a professor at Johns Hopkins University, and he calls this his grid of pain. And once you complete it, you understand why. But he asked us to rename it, and I renamed it the grid of empowerment, right? Because I do believe that this is where change happens, in the management of change. So we're going to move into the change management portion of this presentation, and we'll look at the managing complex change diagram through the lens of Bowman and Dill's reframing leadership chart. And I'm not sure if you all received the managing change diagram. I believe I sent it out early. But the complex change diagram lists the vision, the goals, the skills. And so I'm going to take a minute and just talk through on the Bowman and Dill's what's called reframing leadership. And you'll see that in the human frame, political frame, structural frame, and symbolic frame. So the human frame, these are the critical people that support the work. You need to ask the question, who is already supportive? Who will need to be moved along in this work, right? Where are they? Are they at the identity and reflection stage? Are they at the awareness stage, knowledge stage? Or have they honed the skills and they're ready to do the work? Who are you hiring to fulfill your mission and vision? What relationships are being fostered within the current human capacity at your institution? For the political frame, how will you communicate to your stakeholders? Seeing the needs and concerns of multiple stakeholder groups to accommodate and integrate the needs and concerns of these stakeholders. For the structural framework, what systems are currently in place that will help or hinder this work? Here's where you seek to analyze the key features and needs of the organization and environment. And you need to have a strategic capacity building within the organization. And then lastly, you have the symbolic frame. How will you communicate the progress and success along the way? And you will focus on culture and the organic narrative of the organization, right? This is where I say you get to craft the narrative around this work. So we're going to move into some breakout rooms and discuss this framework. And I actually have this, I'm going to put this in the chat and hopefully you can access it. Because I don't think you can see my screen in the breakout rooms. I can't remember. I'm going to put this, it's access to the Google Drive. And you should have this chart right here. And when you move into the breakout groups, this chart takes time to go through. But I want you to have a discussion with those in the breakout rooms around where you see yourself in this work, where's your school on the continuum, and you know, what's your human, political, structural, or symbolic frame around your vision, or your goals and objectives, or skills, right? Your DEI director cannot be the only person that has this framework in place, right? Everyone from teachers to administrators should have this framework in place. So I'm going to give you some time to do that in the breakout rooms. So we have a few minutes left, and I wanted to give you an opportunity to kind of share either what you talked about in your breakout rooms or where you think your school or organization, some of you are not at schools, or where you think you are, and I'd love to hear. Was your conversation so riveting that you're like, we have nothing else to talk about, we're good to go?
I was just checking my own voice, but I'll share. I think in my group with Emily and Penda, and I'm sorry if I'm not saying your name correctly, Penda, I think the thing that became crystal clear is just the really understanding the context we're in, what we bring as individuals to that institution, and then really, you know, like taking that first step, or, you know, where Penda said, like, really doing the work to create a safe space where people feel like they can ask the questions that they need to ask in order to do the work. So I would say that, yeah, having a really good understanding of your context, creating that space, and then really taking that to the next level. And I'm saying this, though it seems obvious, it is so clear that we must not be afraid of creating those safe spaces.
And I think that would really come out if you're looking at the reframing leadership, when you look at the symbolic framework, is really being transparent about just that, right? This is a safe space. This is an opportunity for us to share with each other, really bringing that out and being transparent about that in your vision and in your action plan. I really like that. Anyone else have anything they'd like to share to the group, or any questions you may even have is fine as well. Nope, you guys are all good. Well, I really do.
Leah, I'll jump in.
Yeah, go ahead.
And I'm just going to share something that I know that you know that I want to share with this group. We've been doing this work for a really long time. Personally, I've been at it since 1998, and I've not seen a lot of change. And I think one of the things that I want to leave you all with is that where the decisions are made, we've got to focus on that. Our students are going to be okay if we as adults get ourselves together. So training the adults, the parents, training the administration, and training the board around these issues, very, very, very critical. Because if they're making, if you only have one person of color on your faculty, that's not the faculty of color's problem. That's the people who are making the decisions, the hiring decisions. It's January right now. We're at a Carney Sando event. Schools need to make a plan to make sure that they are going to change. Having one person of color is not good. It doesn't matter what size your school is. Having students in classrooms where they are the only students of color today in 2021 is not good, and we need a plan, and the plans are made by those who are in our administration. So that's what I want to share with you. Take that back to your schools and tell them, fix themselves.
Thank you, LaRonda. And one of the things I think that really hinders us from doing that is asking the hard question. So if you look through this presentation, it was a lot of questions, right? Ask those hard questions, ask your administration those really difficult questions, right? They call them those elephant in the room questions. Ask them, right? And then you can begin to create an action plan around those hard questions. But if no one asks those questions, then they remain unchanged, right? And you got to ask those questions. Then you can put them within those different areas in the chart that you have, but you really must ask those questions. Mm-hmm. I agree. And when we talk about cultural competency, a lot of times we think, oh, well, I need to learn about someone else's culture. Well, have you taken any time to really know your culture, right? What kind of culture have you created at your school, right? And then begin to ask those questions. Are you competent in your own culture? And 9 times out of 10, we are not, right? We are not evaluating our culture. We're not monitoring our culture. So that is another area that we need to make sure we're ready for.
Dr. Nestor, I would also want to say that I think that these action plans are probably going to have some level of differentiation in them, because everybody getting involved, or you're trying to bring into the work and bring into the movement, if you will, are going to be at different places. We talked about this in our breakout group. We're going to be in different places on the road, on the journey. So know that it's not going to be a one size fits all plan. It's going to be highly differentiated, most likely.
I agree. And Mary, I love you for manifesting a doctorate down the road, but I do not have my doctorate degree. Love you for manifesting it, but I do not have that degree. That's a whole, we're going to leave that away. I think Lizette, if that's how you say your name, I think she had her hand raised.
Yeah, I appreciated what you said about asking hard questions. And I think sometimes it's also, LaRonda, you were saying like, oh, one adult of color isn't enough, or how many students. I like to say, like, when we begin talking about diversity, I'll ask what essentially becomes a hard question, but what seemingly is an innocuous question. Like, so are we talking about ethnic diversity? Are we talking about gender representation? And then it's like this deer in headlights. And what I like about, not that I'm trying to make people feel that way, but it's, can we just be clear on what it is that we're talking about? Because then I think we end up talking through each other and across, and that also prevents the movement forward, because we were all thinking we were having the same conversation around diversity. What are we saying? Are we talking about representation? Are we talking about inclusion? Are we talking about anti-racism? So playing that, like, what exactly is the conversation we're having right now? Or when people say, oh, we need more people of color on staff, I'll say, why? I'd love to hear from you why that's important to you. Because again, it's the articulation. Is it just counting bodies? Is it like, I see myself both as important for kids of color, because I never saw myself. And I also see it as I need the majority of white kids to also see someone in front of the classroom, not just behind the counter serving them lunch, which is fine. I did that too in college. Like, they're all okay. And so anyways, it's like pushing a little bit and clarifying the what before we even begin. That's my offering.
The what and the why. My favorite quote, and I wish I could tell you who said it, but someone said to me, and you know, at this point could have been LaRhonda. She's always spitting out wisdom. Someone said one time that plantations were diverse. And I will forever use that when I'm talking to independent schools, right? About, well, we need more diversity. Okay, well, plantations were extremely diverse, right? But why? And I really like that point. I think Nadine had her hand raised as well.
I really appreciated you talking about the trauma, how it impacts mental health, and the development of the child and for anyone. And I think why that's important is, I think if we recognize and acknowledge the trauma, we would look at this closely like how we look at child protection and child safeguarding. We attack that from, especially how that shift has gone in the international world. We attack that in different arenas. We attack it on the recruiting end, we attack it on the reporting end, the accountability, you know, how we build culture, what's acceptable, what's not. I think if we paid attention to the trauma that racism causes, institutional racism causes, and how our systems in international and independent schools perpetuate it, white supremacy. I think if we were to look at that way as a trauma, there would be more of an urgency to address it. And I'm wondering, how do we make, because I agree with you, we have to start with the people that are ready. But when you've been doing this work for a long time, how long do you keep waiting for people to be ready? At what point do you have to push the envelope a little bit more?
You know what I really love about this change management chart is it's an accountability tool, right? Because if you don't have those pieces, I can begin to see your sincerity. I can begin to see, if you don't have an action plan, I can begin to see how sincere you are, right? If you don't provide the resources that are needed to do this work, I can begin to see how sincere you are. So a lot of reasons why change doesn't happen is because one or more of those pieces are missing, right? And there's no accountability for this work, right? The monitoring evaluation is so important. You should be able to monitor and evaluate that one faculty member that refuses to do this work, right? That's where you begin to see the change. And I think what LaRhonda was saying earlier are our administration, the decision makers, who is monitoring and evaluating them, right? And that's where some of this change really, that's where some of the barriers are, right? And what, you know, I'll be honest, I'm at a school where I've done this work for a while, but I also can see, and I've used this change management system here to do a lot of changes, but there are serious stakeholders here that are still a barrier to this work, right? But I can see that, I can identify it, I know what it is, right? Now I have to make the decision of, is this a place I want to stay, or is it time for me to go, right? So those are some of the you know, the kind of accountability tools that you need to be looking at, right? Is what is in place, what has been in place, and are they willing to put something in place? And I'm absolutely loving this conversation. My information is on the slides, and I believe Cardi Sando will send those out or add those to the session, but I appreciate your time and you being here. Please reach out if you have any questions or if you need anything. Thank you so much.